I never thought the person everyone ignored in that building would become the reason an entire institution had to rethink what respect actually meant. For 16 years, people walked past Norm Callahan like he was part of the furniture, like the mop bucket beside him had a louder voice than he did. But the day a wealthy museum director tried to fire him for helping a lonely kid discover his love for art, nobody expected the truth about Norm's past to come crashing through those polished marble walls. Because Norm wasn't just the guy who cleaned the floors after closing time. He was the man who had once changed hundreds of young lives. And somehow, the world had forgotten his name. I met people like Norm before, the kind of person who shows up every day, does the work nobody notices, and never complains loud enough for anyone to listen. That was Norm. Every night at the Hawthorne Center for Modern Arts in Portland, Oregon, he carried the same old flashlight, checked every door twice, cleaned every hallway, and made sure the priceless paintings hanging on those walls were safe until morning. Most visitors never saw him. Most employees barely knew him. To them, he was just the night custodian, the guy who appeared after everyone else went home. The building had hundreds of conversations happening every day about creativity, talent, and human expression. But somehow the man who understood those things better than almost anyone was the one person nobody bothered to ask about his story. Then there was Adrian Vance, the museum's operations director. Adrian was the kind of person who measured importance by job titles, expensive suits, and who had their name printed on a plaque somewhere. He wasn't cruel every second of the day, but he had a habit of making people feel small, especially people he thought couldn't challenge him. To Adrian, the museum was a machine, and everyone inside it had a specific function. Curators created, donors funded, executives decided, custodians cleaned. That was the entire equation in his mind. One evening, while walking through the East Gallery, Adrian saw Norm carefully wiping fingerprints from a display case. He stopped, looked around, and said, "You know, Norm, sometimes people confuse being useful with having a career." Norm looked up from his work for a moment. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He just gave a small nod. The kind of nod you give when you realize someone has already decided who you are before they ever learned your name. What Adrian didn't know was that 17 years earlier, Norm had stood in front of a classroom full of teenagers, not a mop bucket, and those students had called him the best teacher they ever had. Before the late-night shifts, before the quiet life, before becoming invisible, Norm Callahan had been one of the most respected art educators in the state. He had won the Oregon Arts Education Award after spending nearly 20 years teaching young people how to see the world differently. His students had gone on to study at major art schools across the country. Some became designers. Some became painters. Some simply became adults who never forgot the teacher who believed in them before anyone else did. But life has a strange way of taking things away without asking permission. When the school district faced massive budget cuts, the arts program was one of the first things eliminated. The classroom where Norm spent decades teaching was gone almost overnight. The students moved on. The awards went into storage. And Norm, who had spent his entire life encouraging others to chase their dreams, suddenly found himself trying to figure out what happened when your own dream disappears. He didn't leave because he stopped caring. He left because bills still existed, because life still moved forward, and because sometimes talented people have to take whatever work is available. One night shift became 6 months. 6 months became years. Eventually, 16 years passed. The strange thing about being forgotten is that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly. People stop asking questions. They stop looking closer. They stop wondering if there is more behind the person standing in front of them. And that was exactly what happened to Norm. Until one rainy Thursday night, when he walked into the museum's main gallery and found something that reminded him exactly who he used to be. A young boy sitting alone on the floor, holding a sketchbook against his knees, staring at one of the largest paintings in the entire building. His pencil moved slowly across the page, carefully trying to recreate what he saw. Norm could have walked away. He could have simply reported the situation and followed procedure. After all, that was what Adrian Vance would have wanted. But Norm saw something else. He saw a kid who wasn't breaking rules. He saw a kid who was searching for something. And after 16 years of feeling invisible, Norm recognized that feeling better than anyone. He quietly pulled over a chair, sat beside the boy, and said, "Mind if I show you something?" The boy looked up, surprised that someone had actually noticed him. And for the first time in years, Norm wasn't a custodian standing in the corner. He was a teacher again. For the next hour, the Hawthorne Center for Modern Arts wasn't a museum after closing. It was a classroom again. The polished floors, the expensive paintings, the quiet halls that usually felt so serious and untouchable suddenly became something much simpler. It became a place where one person cared enough to sit beside another person and say, "Let's figure this out together." The boy's name was Ethan Ellery. He was 12 years old, quiet, thoughtful, and the kind of kid who seemed like he was always carrying a question in his head but wasn't sure if anyone wanted to hear it. Norm noticed the way Ethan held his pencil too tightly, the way his shoulders tensed every time he erased a line, like every mistake was proof that he wasn't good enough. Norm had seen that before. He had seen it in hundreds of students over the years, the fear that talent had to be perfect before it was worth sharing. So he leaned over and said, "Don't fight the mistake. Sometimes the mistake is where you find the interesting part." Ethan looked at him and smiled for the first time that night. It was a small smile, but Norm noticed. Teachers always notice those things, the little moments other people miss. They adjusted the perspective of the drawing, talked about shadows, talked about why certain artists made unusual choices, and for a while, Norm forgot about everything else. He forgot that he was wearing a maintenance uniform instead of standing in front of a classroom. He forgot that the world had moved on without him. He was simply doing what he was always meant to do, helping someone see something they couldn't see before. What Norm didn't know was that security cameras had captured the entire moment, and what he definitely didn't know was that the next morning, that same footage would be used against him. Adrian Vance called him into his office before the museum officially opened. The room was exactly what you would expect from someone like Adrian, perfectly organized. Expensive furniture, awards on the wall, everything designed to remind visitors that important people worked there. Norm stood near the door holding his old flashlight, waiting. Adrian didn't offer him a seat. That detail bothered Norm more than he wanted to admit. After 16 years of working there, after keeping that building safe night after night, he was still treated like someone who had just walked in by accident. Adrian picked up a folder from his desk. "Do you understand the seriousness of what happened last night?" he asked. Norm looked confused. "I helped the child with the drawing." Adrian opened the folder. "You allowed an unregistered minor to remain inside a secured facility after hours. You failed to file an incident report. You created liability for this institution." Norm listened quietly as Adrian listed each violation. Not one question about Ethan. Not one question about why the boy was there. Not one question about what actually happened. Just rules. Just paperwork. Just another opportunity to prove that Norm was exactly what Adrian thought he was. Replaceable. Adrian slid a suspension notice across the desk. "You have been here a long time, Norm, but that doesn't mean you get to make decisions outside your position." Those words landed harder than Norm expected. Not because they were insulting, because somewhere deep down, he realized Adrian actually believed them. Adrian truly believed a person's value stopped at their job description. Norm picked up the paper but didn't sign it immediately. He looked around the office for a moment. The walls were covered with photographs of famous artists, successful donors, and important figures connected to the museum. But nowhere was there a picture of the people who quietly kept the place alive. The cleaners, the security staff, the assistants, the people who showed up when nobody was watching. Finally, Norm reached for the pen, but before he could write anything, Adrian's office phone rang. Adrian looked annoyed. He almost ignored it, but when he saw the name on the screen, his expression changed. The caller was Richard Ellery, one of the museum's founding donors and the person responsible for funding several major expansions over the years. Adrian immediately straightened his posture. His voice became warmer, professional, respectful, the same respect he never showed Norm. "Mr. Ellery? Good morning. How can I help you?" What happened next was something nobody in that office expected. Richard wasn't calling to complain. He wasn't calling to demand answers. He was calling because his son had done something he hadn't done in over a year. He had drawn again. Richard explained that Ethan had stopped creating after losing his mother 14 months earlier. The sketchbooks that used to follow him everywhere had been sitting untouched. Therapy helped, family helped, time helped, but nothing brought that passion back until the night before, until someone sat beside him without judging him. Richard asked Adrian one simple question. "Who was the man who stayed with my son in the gallery?" Adrian looked toward Norm. For the first time, there was uncertainty in his face. He'd expected an angry parent. He had expected a complaint. He had never expected gratitude. Before Adrian could answer, Another email notification appeared on his computer. It was from Silas Mercer, the museum's senior curator. Silas was one of the few people in the building who had ever taken the time to talk to Norm beyond a quick greeting. He had always suspected there was more to him. After seeing the security footage, Silas started searching, and what he found changed everything. He had uncovered Norm's old teaching records, the awards, the articles, the testimonials from former students, the career that had somehow disappeared into 16 years of night shifts. Silas attached the documents and sent them directly to Richard Ellery. Richard read every page. Then he went silent, because suddenly the story was no longer about a custodian who broke a rule. It was about a master teacher who had spent years standing in the shadows while everyone else took credit for keeping the light on. Richard called Adrian back. His voice was different this time, colder, more serious. "You understand who you were about to suspend, right?" Adrian didn't answer. "That man didn't put your museum at risk. He reminded you what your museum was supposed to be about." Those words stayed in the room. Adrian looked down at the suspension form sitting between them. Just minutes earlier, he had felt powerful, certain. He believed he was protecting the institution. Now he was realizing he had almost pushed away the very kind of person the institution claimed to celebrate. But the biggest surprise was still coming. Richard Ellery wasn't just calling to thank Norm. He had a proposal. The museum had been planning a new education wing for years, but they had struggled to find the right person to lead it, someone who understood art, teaching, and the emotional connection between creativity and healing. Richard said he would fund the entire project under one condition. The person leading the program had to be Norm Callahan. Adrian looked across the desk. The same man he had just treated like a problem was suddenly the answer to the museum's biggest opportunity. And for the first time in 16 years, people weren't asking what Norm cleaned. They were asking what Norm could create. 6 weeks later, the hallway outside the new education wing was crowded with employees, donors, students, and former teachers. There was a new sign on the wall, a name everyone could see, but the person standing beneath it wasn't smiling because of the title. He was smiling because, after all those years of feeling invisible, someone had finally looked closely enough to remember who he really was. The first time Norm Callahan walked into the new education wing, he didn't immediately step inside. He just stood there for a few seconds, staring at the small plaque beside the door with his name engraved on it. Not a job title, not custodian, not night staff, just his name. Norm Callahan, a name that had been forgotten for years, a name that had once filled classrooms and inspired young artists, a name that had almost disappeared behind a uniform and a set of keys. He touched the edge of the plaque with his fingertips and let out a quiet laugh. Later, when someone asked him what was going through his mind at that moment, Norm said, honestly, "I was wondering if they had the wrong person." And that was probably the most Norm thing anyone could have said. After everything that happened, after the award, the recognition, and the sudden attention, he was still the same person who showed up early, helped others without being asked, and stayed late when something needed to be finished. The difference was that now people finally noticed. The opening of the education wing became one of the biggest moments in the history of the Hawthorne Center. Donors arrived, former students arrived, local artists arrived. People who had never even known Norm existed suddenly wanted to hear his story. But Norm never focused on himself. He didn't stand on stage talking about how unfairly he had been treated. He didn't criticize the people who ignored him. He didn't turn his pain into a weapon. Instead, when he spoke, he talked about the students. He talked about Ethan. He talked about every kid who had ever sat in the back of a classroom believing they weren't talented enough. He said the biggest mistake adults make is assuming children need someone to tell them what they can become. Sometimes they just need one person willing to sit beside them long enough for them to believe it themselves. That philosophy quickly became the foundation of the new program. Norm didn't create a place where students competed against each other. He created a place where they felt safe enough to try. He filled the walls with student artwork, not because every piece was perfect, but because every piece represented courage. He would walk around the room, looking at drawings and paintings, and instead of immediately pointing out what was wrong, he would ask, "What were you trying to say here?" That one question changed the way students thought about art. Because for Norm, art was never just about technique. It was about connection. It was about giving people a way to express things they couldn't always explain with words. Ethan became one of the first students in the program. every few weeks, he would bring Norm a new sketchbook. The shy kid who once sat alone on a cold gallery floor slowly became someone who looked forward to sharing his work. One afternoon, Ethan brought back the same drawing he had started that night months earlier. It had changed completely. The perspective was better. The details were stronger. The most important difference was something only Norm noticed. The drawing no longer looked like someone trying desperately to copy a famous painting. It looked like a young artist finding his own voice. Norm studied the page for a moment and smiled. "You know what I like about this?" he asked. Ethan looked nervous. "What?" Norm pointed at the small imperfections. "These parts right here. They prove you made it. If everything was perfect, I'd wonder if you actually learned anything." Ethan laughed, and that simple moment reminded Norm why he became a teacher in the first place. Not to create famous artists, not to collect awards, but to help people believe they were capable of more than they imagined. As for Adrian Vance, the man who once looked at Norm and saw nothing more than a night employee, things changed quietly. There were no dramatic public apologies, no big confrontation in front of a crowd. Real life usually doesn't work that way. Sometimes the biggest consequences come from simply having to live with the moment you realize you were wrong. Adrian continued working at the museum, but something about him changed. He started greeting employees he had ignored before. He started asking questions instead of giving orders. Some people believed it was because he feared losing his position. Others believed he genuinely learned something. Maybe the truth was somewhere in between, because sometimes people don't change because someone defeats them. Sometimes they change because someone forces them to finally see what they refuse to see. Months later, during a small ceremony for the education wing, Adrian approached Norm privately. For a moment, neither man said anything. There was history between them now, the kind that doesn't disappear with one apology. Finally, Adrian looked at him and said, "I was wrong about you." Norm simply nodded. He didn't need a long speech. He didn't need Adrian to admit everything he had lost, because Norm had already found something more valuable than revenge. He had found his purpose again. He replied, "A lot of people were wrong about me. The important thing is what you do after you realize it." And that was the kind of answer only someone like Norm could give. Someone who had every reason to be bitter, but chose not to be. Someone who had spent years being overlooked, yet still chose to notice others. Looking back, the most important moment in this entire story wasn't the donor's phone call. It wasn't the plaque on the wall. It wasn't even the day everyone discovered Norm's incredible past. The most important moment happened when nobody was watching. A 12-year-old boy sat alone in a gallery, struggling with a drawing, and a man who had every reason to believe the world had forgotten him stopped and helped. No cameras, no recognition, no reward waiting at the end, just kindness. And maybe that is what makes Norm's story so powerful. Because every day, we pass people we think we understand. We see their clothes, their jobs, their positions, and we create an entire story about them in our minds. We decide who matters and who doesn't. We decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. But sometimes, the person quietly cleaning the room is the person who has spent a lifetime teaching others how to see the world. Sometimes the person standing in the background is carrying a history more meaningful than anyone in the spotlight. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary at first? Someone people ignored or underestimated, but later you discovered they had an incredible story hidden beneath the surface? Maybe it was a teacher, a coworker, a neighbor, or a complete stranger who showed kindness at the exact moment you needed it. Share that story in the comments, because those moments remind us that every person has a chapter we haven't read yet. And if Norm's journey taught us anything, it's this. Never confuse someone's current position with their true value, because the person you overlooked today might be the person who changes your life tomorrow.